Hello, class. For my hot topic in education, I chose charter schools, and in particular, I chose Arkansas charter schools. So, what is a charter school? A charter school is a public school. They're publicly funded. They use state funds and federal funds, but they have a little bit more autonomy in how they can operate. So, they have more autonomy in their curriculum and in their governance. And in addition to that, the charters are granted for fixed lengths of time, usually 3 to 5 years, at which time the body that authorized the charter reviews the performance of the school and decides whether or not to renew it. So if the charter is underperforming, the school can potentially be dissolved. So, what are some of the advantages to this extra autonomy that they're given? A charter school can lengthen the school day, mix grades, require dress codes, put teachers on their school boards, double up instruction in core subject areas like math or reading. And in the case of Arkansas charter schools, you can teach at a charter school in Arkansas without having a teaching license. So, in essence, the promise of charter schools is that they'll provide educational alternatives to students and parents, and that they'll also stimulate traditional public schools to improve through competitive pressure. So, that's what the proponents of charter schools say. What do the detractors say? Well, some common criticisms leveled against charter schools is that they'll steal public funding from traditional public schools, that they'll be selective in the kinds of students that they'll accept. In essence, they'll steal the cream of the crop away from traditional public schools, and that they won't serve historically underserved families. So, how has this all shaken out in practice? Who's right? Is it the proponents or the detractors? Well, let's look at some of the data. We'll first look at funding. So, as it relates to Arkansas, it's just not true that charter schools steal funds from traditional public schools, and that's because of the way that educational funding, is structured in Arkansas. So the way it works is that funds are allocated on a per pupil basis, and currently that's between about $7,000 and $8,000 a year per pupil. So if you have a student at a traditional public school and they transfer to a charter school, the funds follow that student. If the story ended there, then you would see no difference in the revenue streams between traditional public schools and charter schools. But because traditional public schools are allowed to collect local property taxes, traditional public schools do end up with more money per student per year than charter schools. And the difference ends up being about 15%. So charter schools have about 15% less money to spend per pupil per year than traditional public schools. So that's funding. Let's move on to demographics. So, is it true that there's a substantial difference in the demographics between charter schools and traditional public schools? Well, when it comes to students who qualify for free and reduced lunch, in other words, the more economically challenged of the students, there's very little difference between the makeup of traditional public schools and charter schools. Traditional public schools have about 58% of their student body that qualifies for free and reduced lunch, and charter schools have about 54% of their student body composed of students who qualify for free and reduced lunch. Let's move on to performance. So, this is probably the hardest area to evaluate. There's just a lot of conflicting information. So, I'll start off with this statistic that I found at the Arkansas Democrat Gazette that was pulled from the Arkansas Department of Education. So the claim is that 46% of Arkansas charter schools received a D or F designation compared to 32% of public schools overall. So if you just looked at that one statistic, it would appear that charter schools are doing pretty poorly, but it doesn't appear to be that clear cut. The University of Central Arkansas makes the claim that as more students attend open enrollment charter schools, test scores increase in the traditional public schools, and they base that statement on a study by the E-Journal of Education Policy. Also, the University of Arkansas Office of Education Policy claims that students attending open enrollment charter schools are consistently demonstrating greater value-added academic growth and achievement than their peers in traditional public schools. So it seems like, depending on who you ask, charter schools are either doing a little bit better or a little bit worse than traditional public schools. So the Last issue I want to address are socioeconomic factors, which affect both traditional public schools and charter schools. And I found this to be the most interesting bit of data overall. If you look at a school's percentage of economically disadvantaged students and you compare that to the overall rating of the school, they track very closely. These are all charter schools, and anytime that the percentage of economically disadvantaged students is low, the overall grade for the school will be high. And it's very consistent from one charter school to the next. And I don't have the same data to show for traditional public schools, but from what I've read, it's mirrors the same effect. If you have a lot of poor students in your school, generally your school is going to do poorly. And that seems to be a problem that neither traditional public schools or charter schools have managed to figure out. So, based upon my research, I couldn't find either a ringing endorsement for charter schools in Arkansas or anything that proved they're an abject failure. It seemed like it was a bit of a mixed bag. Now, something I will say about charter schools is that they do, in some cases, provide some skills training that's hard to measure. For example, the Don Tyson School of Innovation has a robust workforce development program that is producing workforce-ready graduates, and the skills they're learning are performance-based, so it's something that's a little bit harder to measure. I'll also say that considering that only 6% of Arkansas public school students are attending open enrollment charter schools, it's maybe a little bit too early to tell whether they're living up to their promise. And the Arkansas government seems to agree, as it's recently removed the cap on charters through the LEARNS Act. So that's the conclusion of my talk. I appreciate you guys watching. Thanks.